President Vladimir Putin will formally annex occupied regions of Ukraine on Friday, following so-called sham referendums to join Russia.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, thousands of Russians have fled to Georgia, but the mass exodus has caused rental prices to skyrocket.
Sweden's Coast Guard identifies a fourth crack in the Nord Stream pipelines. Stockholm, Denmark, the EU and NATO say the leaks are due to sabotage.
Moscow has announced that President Vladimir Putin will formally annex 4 occupied regions of Ukraine on Friday, after the results of the so-called sham referendums to join Russia were announced. The votes, which were carried out under Russian military supervision, have been slammed as a travesty of democracy by the West and most of the international community. Ukraine says it will continue to fight to liberate the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia.
EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is calling on EU member states to agree on a new raft of sanctions against Russian officials and trade in response to sham referendums held in 4 occupied regions of Ukraine. Well, Russian news agency TASS says that Russia will formally annex Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk on Friday, after armed troops went door-to-door collecting ballots, at times at gunpoint, on joining Russia. Well, with me now is Donica Obachoin, Professor of Post-Soviet Politics at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us. What do you think that we can now expect next from Russia?
Well, the purpose of these sham referenda was to create some kind of legal veneer for what is an old-style imperialist land grab. So once these votes are announced, and they have been announced with implausible majorities, 99% saying yes in Donetsk, even though they only have control of about 60% of the territory, with a 97.5% turnout, even though so many people have fled, it would be hard to establish where they're living right now. We're going to just simply see a formal, legal process take place in Russia where these territories are annexed, and that would be, I think, announced tomorrow. I think that's what's expected.
And of course, we do have a precedent for this in terms of Crimea, and thinking back to the situation there, how closely does the situation now mirror that one, and does that give us any further indications?
I think the situation is far more fluid in these 4 regions than it is in Crimea. There was no conflict, there was no war zone in Crimea in 2014, but the areas that we're looking at here, none of the areas are fully under Kremlin control. And somewhere like Zaporizhia, they don't even control the regional capital. So they're claiming far more territory than they control. And this is an active conflict zone, which they don't control. So no, it's not exactly the same as Crimea. I think that there's going to be a fight back and a counteroffensive continuing on behalf of the Ukrainians, and Western support will continue, in terms of supporting Ukraine's military endeavors. And that wasn't the case in 2014. The West was rather passive, and Ukraine didn't try and initiate any major, military offensive to regain the territory of Crimea.
Russian military leadership has likely failed to set information conditions for the potential defeat of the Russian grouping in Liman, despite increasingly concerned discourse regarding the potential for Ukrainian envelopment there. So says the Institute for the Study of War, pointing at the significant Ukrainian gains around Liman over the past couple of days. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense has not addressed current Russian losses around Liman or prepared for the collapse of this sector of the front line, which will likely further reduce already low Russian morale. Ukrainian troops advanced from different sides and are working to complete the envelopment of Russian troops here. The collapse of the Liman pocket will likely be highly consequential to the Russian grouping in northern Donetsk and western Luhansk regions, and may allow Ukrainian troops to threaten Russian positions along the western Luhansk region border and in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk area. The Institute for the Study of War assesses that Russian authorities continue to send newly mobilized and undertrained recruits to directly reinforce severely degraded remnants of various units, including units that were previously considered to be Russia's premier conventional fighting force. The UK Defence Ministry, in its intelligence update, says in the 7 days since President Putin announced the partial mobilization, there has been a considerable exodus of Russians seeking to evade call-up. While exact numbers are unclear, it likely exceeds the size of the total invasion force Russia fielded in February 2022. The Institute for the Study of War also says that Russian authorities are beginning to restrict movement of Russian citizens into Russian border regions to cope with hundreds of thousands of Russian men attempting to flee the country.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russians have been flocking to the neighboring country of Georgia. Local authorities say more than 10,000 Russians are crossing the border each day. But their suitcases aren't the only things Russian citizens have brought along with them. The massive influx of people fleeing has allegedly caused rental prices to explode.
Rent prices jumped up in April by 60% on average. Then the prices stabilized. This demand for rentals comes from wealthy migrants mainly. They rent because buying property seems unreasonable to them, since this is only temporary.
Some Russians who fled to Georgia are aware of the impact of the immigration and claim that they're even thinking of moving away.
We participated in the anti-war protests in St. Petersburg. They launched an administrative investigation against us. So we decided not to wait for the situation to worsen, and we fled. We were considering buying an apartment here, but Georgia got so overcrowded lately due to the tide of immigration that we decided not to take advantage of the hospitality of this country and people anymore and solve our problems independently elsewhere.
But according to the Georgian National Association of Real Estate, in the last few days there has been an increase in the demand for purchasing properties.
There is a demand on buying land since the mobilization was announced. However, most of these people do not have money and cannot afford buying property.
The massive influx of Russians has caused a backlash among the local population. Some real estate agents are reluctant to rent their properties to Russian citizens, afraid that they will not pay rent and become squatters.
Residents in the village of Wysokopilia in the Kherson region, recaptured by Ukrainian forces, are honouring the fallen and collecting everything that can be salvaged. Crumbling houses and vehicles cut with bullets are what's left of this once sleepy settlement. Local man Vladimir visits the graves of his deceased neighbours. He can't help crying as he remembers them.
This is the grave of Lukashev, who was shot at the bricks plant. That one is of a person who was killed in bed. Those are of a man and his wife, the Lanivichs, Svetlana and her man. Oh, sorry, I just can't.
Wysokopilia, home to some 4,000 people before the invasion, was one of the first settlements freed in Ukraine's eastern counter-offensive. According to local residents, 3 villagers were shot by Russian soldiers.
My daughter, 4 years old, knows here is a BM-21 Grad, there is a multiple rocket launcher, there is a tank, and that one is a rocket mortar.
Meanwhile, residents in Izum have been left traumatised after months of occupation. The authorities finally exhumed more than 400 bodies from a forest in the area last week. However, President Zelensky announced last Sunday that 2 more mass burial sites have been discovered in the city. The Swedish Coast Guard says a 4th leak has been detected in a Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline running through the Baltic Sea. An official told Sweden's Svenska Dagbladet newspaper that 2 of the leaks are in Danish waters. And now 2 are on the Swedish side of the maritime border. It's the latest in a series of such incidents, which Western governments are calling sabotage and are blaming Russia. Nord Stream 1 and 2 were built to supply Germany and other European countries, but their operation has been suspended following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Swedish media has reported the 4th leak is coming from Nord Stream 2 and close to the site of another alleged attack on the pipeline. In response to the apparent acts of sabotage, Norway is heightening security around its oil and gas wells. The country is now a vital source of energy for Europe as it tries to wean itself off Russian gas.
Europe could replace the disappearance of Russian gas, but if we experience a drop in Norwegian gas too, then the European economy would collapse. It would be a dark and cold winter.
The Kremlin has rejected the West's accusation that it has attacked the pipelines. It has instead pointed the finger at the US, which was long opposed to the Nord Stream 2 project. Moscow has called for a UN Security Council meeting on the issue.